All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today. We're going to be covering an interesting topic. It's a very specific topic of Power BI, and I think I probably stretched it out to a point we'll fill the entire session, but don't be shocked if we end a few minutes early. If that's the case, I'll be happy to take questions the rest of the way out. But we're looking at a fairly new feature as far as the templates piece of Power BI. Parameters have been around for a little bit. They've actually been around since Power BI Desktop was released, and actually you could do the same features in Excel Power BI as well, but they've now put and wrapped a nice UI around parameters, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. But before we get too far into that, let me go ahead and introduce myself. If you don't know who I am, my name is Devin Knight. I am the training director here at Pragmatic Works. So anything having to do with training, things like webinars that we're in today, usually I have some involvement in. It's more heavily on Liz, but we also have a lot of paid training that I'm involved with as well, things like workshops, boot camps, and on-demand streaming training. All that usually goes to me in some way. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. They call it a data platform MVP now, and I've authored a few books all having to do with SQL Server. I also run a local user group here in Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I'm from. I run a group, SQL Server user group called JSUG, or Jacksonville SQL Server User Group. I also blog at a website called devinknightsql.com. I recommend going there because I do have a lot of blogs on Power BI. Right now I'm doing a blog series on all the custom visualizations. I've been releasing one of those a week. I think we're about 11 or 12 into that. And then I have a blog similar to what we're going to be talking about today regarding parameters in my blog as well. So you can find that if you go to devinknightsql.com. You'll be able to find a lot of good Power BI stuff out there. All right, so I'm very minimal on slides, especially today. Usually I'll have more than this, but really I have one slide for you, and then we're going to get into pretty much demos the rest of the way out. So if you're jumping in a bit late, you might completely miss demos, the slides altogether here, because really I want to get right into the demonstration of how to use some of these features. Like I mentioned before, parameters have been around for a while, but what's new to parameters is the fact that they've now wrapped a UI around them, so it's much easier to create and use parameters. Parameters, really, the design behind them, if you've worked with SQL or any kind of coding language where you can parameterize code, it's kind of the idea of creating a variable that you can pass values into and make things dynamic inside of your solution. And it's fairly nice how it works. You can make things like your filters dynamic inside of a query. You can make the actual connection itself dynamic, and you can be more creative and actually make it so that the columns are dynamic and how the tables can be dynamic as well. There's some ways you can be rather creative with it, and I'm going to show you a couple of those ways today. Some of the things we'll look at today will be a little bit more advanced in the latter portions, but for the most part, a lot of these things aren't terribly difficult. There's a UI, like I said, that they've now wrapped around doing parameters, so they've made it much easier to work with. So that's the idea of parameters. How do I make things dynamic? How do I make it so that I can easily change the values that we're working with? So last thing on parameters, just think about it like this. I'm pulling in some information, and I'd like to make it so that the source for that query is dynamic. You can use parameters to dynamically filter the results or to dynamically change the connection information. Maybe you want to dynamically change which databases or spreadsheets are being used to import from, and parameters will allow you to do that. Okay, so it's a really neat feature that allows you to make things dynamic. Templates are also pretty useful as well, and the reason I've really packaged these two things together in a webinar is because you really need to do parameters, or you'll likely want to do parameters if you're going to be doing templates. Templates are a nice way to compartmentalize everything that's part of your solution except for the data. Okay, I'll talk about that here in a moment. But that includes things like the query, the data model, any visualizations that you've done can all be compartmentalized into a template, into a Power BI template. And you'll likely use parameters as a way to make that template dynamic, so that way when someone opens up the template, they can easily type in, say for example, the server name that they're going to be getting the data from, or maybe the Excel file that they've stored the data from, and that way whenever they type in that information that's relevant to them, it'll create and modify the report data, the actual results, to be depicted based on their version of the data, not necessarily the one that you had when you created it. So templates are going to be used with parameters. And again, the idea of templates is that it's going to really compartmentalize everything that's part of your Power BI solution, inside the Power BI desktop at least, except for the data. It does not save any data. It's simply storing metadata, things like the query that was used, the data model that you put on top of the results, and the report visualization that you used. All those are stored inside the template, and then you use some kind of a parameter to make that template dynamic. So when someone else opens, it's that it can be something specific for them. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of these. You'll use these two things together to create a full solution that you might hand off to someone else. Now, before we get into our first demo here, I'll go ahead and go over the demo slide at least. What I'd like to do is do a quick review or a quick demonstration of how you might have done parameters in the past. Okay, so if you've done parameters at all in the past, say 5-6 months ago, then and prior to that, then you were probably doing it through a more manual process. And I'd like to show you that manual process first so you can kind of appreciate what you now have available and the new UI that they've provided to you for doing parameters. All right, so let me go ahead and pull open my Power BI desktop. So let me go ahead and launch that. I apologize for the messy desktop there. Had a lot of things I needed recently. And what we're going to do is I'm going to be pulling in some data from some sports data. Okay, so you guys are probably aware there's a lot of sporting events that are going on either now or coming soon. For example, the Olympics are going on. I actually went to try and find some Olympics data. We have the National Football League is starting back here. It's already got preseason going on. And so what I thought I'd do is bring in some relevant data. I could have done Olympics. Didn't look like I could find any easy data to work with the Olympics. I'm sure there is out there somewhere. But I thought what I'd do is go ahead and pull in some NFL data and use that as a way to be able to show you how you would use parameters in the past. Okay, and as you might already be aware of, you can pull data from a web page. And so what I'm looking at here is NFL.com, and I'm looking at all the teams' offensive statistics. Okay, so these are all the stats for the NFL teams and what they're doing offensively. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to take the URL from the very top part of the web browser here. I'm going to copy that and go back over to Power BI Desktop that I just launched a few seconds ago. All right, now whenever you launch Power BI Desktop, you do get a little startup screen here. It's prompting me to sign in. I'm not so concerned with signing in right now because we're not going to be deploying anything. We're more focused in on the desktop tool. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. All right. Now, I've gotten this blank design surface for the Power BI Desktop, and what I'd like to do is walk you through again how things would have been done in the past, and then we'll get to the point where we can talk about how things are done now. Really, both of them are really nice features, but they've just made it easier for you to do now. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by going up to the top ribbon here. We're underneath the home ribbon, and I'm going to tell it that I want to go to Get Data. And underneath Get Data, I can tell it that I want to pull in data from a web page. That's the web page I had open just a few moments ago. So I'll select Web, and I'll paste in the URL here. Okay. Now, if you've started working with parameters, the new version of parameters already, then you might notice that there's something missing from here. I'm going to show you that here in a little bit, how you can get, there's an extra feature where I can parameterize the URL right now, but it's not turned on by default. So I'm going to show you how to turn that feature on in a bit after we go through this old way first. All right, so I pasted in the URL. I'll hit OK. It's now going to bring that URL into a navigator section, and this navigator section is going to find all of the objects that are on that web page and determine which ones of them can actually be used for importing data. Well, I have one here called Document that doesn't really have a whole lot to it over here, and then I have one here called Table 0, which looks like it actually has the information that I want. So I'll select Table 0, and then I'll go down to the bottom and select Edit. All right, so this gives me the results from that web page we looked at just a moment ago, and I can rename the query over here on the right-hand side, call it something like NFL data if I wanted to. And then what I really want to do, though, is I want to parameterize this so that rather than looking at just a single year of data, remember when we were back looking at this page, we were only looking at 2015 data here. I want to parameterize that so that I can actually make it so that I can look at 2014 data or 13 or whichever year I care about at the moment. And we can also make it so that I can pass in a bucket of years, tell me, like, for example, give me everything between 2000 and 2015, and bring back all of the data for that range of years. So that's some features that we can do that parameters allow us to do. And so let's start with first, how do we make that happen? How do we make it so that we can pass in a value for the year and get the results to be changed? Well, the old method for doing this was all about going to the Advanced Editor. And so if I wanted to do the old style, I would go up to the Advanced Editor, and I would create a parameter. Okay, and a parameter was all written in mQuery. This is mQuery that you're looking at here right now, and I would modify the mQuery that was created by the designer, by the query designer here, or query editor, and I would add in a parameter to it so I can make it dynamic. So for example, I would come up to the top here, and I would create a parameter. Let's call this something like years. Okay, and when you create a parameter, you do this little equals greater than sign here to be able to identify it as a parameter. So there's my parameter I've referenced, okay? And then I would tell it where do I want to use that parameter. Again, this is all we have to do to define a parameter is come up to the top, do in parentheses, and whatever the name of the parameter is, and then an equal greater than sign. That's a declaring a parameter. Then inside the actual query, you tell it where do you want to replace that parameter, that variable. Where do you want to drop that variable in? And for me, it's I want to replace this section here called season, where it has a hard-coded year of 2015. I want to replace that with the parameter that we just created. So to do that, I would do a simple little concatenation, and I would tell it I want to put in the middle and replace 2015 with my year parameter, or years, I think I called it. All right, now one other piece that I usually recommend to do for this, if you're using a string URL like we are here, you oftentimes want to make sure that you convert the number that is going to be a year to text. So there's a little function here inside of M called number.toText, and that'll take a number value and convert it to a string value, which we need because we're looking at a URL string here. So that little highlighted section there, that's really all I had to add, and what that does is it allows me to parameterize the year now with a variable or a parameter that we created. All right, so once I've gotten that, I'll hit done, and you'll notice that it converts the query here, and it now allows me to type in a parameter value. So if I come up to the top here and I type in a value, let's say I type in 2007, hit invoke, you'll see here that it returns back the results. And how do I know this is 2007 data? Well, I can tell you just by being a poor Jaguars fan that we have not been ranked number 7 in offense in quite some time. So I can tell you this is definitely very old data, almost 8 or 9 years old here. So that tells me, yes, this indeed did change to a different year. Now, if you wanted to, you can try it out again. I can actually delete the results that just came here, and I can go try it again. If I come back, I can type in something like 2014 instead of 2007 or 15 and hit invoke. And then it gives me new results, and you can see the Jaguars are no longer number 7. They're probably in their rightful place of nearly dead last down here. So that tells me, yes, it's working. It's allowing me to pass in values. You can also see that up in the top here. You can see that it's passing in the value into my function called NFL data. Okay? All right, so let me go ahead and kill this. Now, let us say I wanted to be able to pass in a list of years. Rather than just typing in a single year at a time, I want to pass in a list of years. That's certainly something you can do as well. So if I wanted to do that, I would create another new query. So I would come up to the top here and select new query or new source, and I would select a blank query, because what we're going to do is we're going to generate a list of years, and then I'm going to pass all of those years into the parameter that we've created just a moment ago. All right, so I'll create a blank query, and then I'm going to come up to the top formula bar, and here's how you can get a list of values. If you want to get a list of values inside of the query editor, you'll start with an equal sign up in the formula bar. You'll do the curly braces. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and open and close those curly braces here. And I'm going to start with the year 2000, okay? And I'm going to do ... which is like a between. So I'm going to tell it to bring me everything between 2000 and 2015. That's how I can do a between, and if I hit enter on this, it's going to give me a range of values between those two that I selected a moment ago. By the way, you can also do this if you're looking to do something alphabetically. You can do something like between A and Z. That also works. Notice there we should have all the letters. Okay. Now for our example though, what I'd like to do is I want to get everything between 2000 and 2015. Okay. So that gives me a list of years, and it literally is a list, meaning this is not a table. Even though it looks like a table, this is actually almost like an array. It's a list of values. And so what I'd like to do is, rather than storing this as an array, I want to store it as a table, because that way I can actually connect the function that I have and the table of years that I have. So to convert this to a table as opposed to a list, you'll just come up to the top left here where it says to table, or convert this list to a table. And if I select this option up in the top right here, that'll convert this list to a table. All right, so I'll go ahead and select that. This is just kind of any kind of warnings or errors that you might have when you do this conversion. How do you want to handle those? I'll just hit OK. There's no errors I'm anticipating here. And then I'll go ahead and rename this to year. All right, good deal. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I've gotten that data. I'm going to go ahead and rename this query as well. I'll call this all NFL data. Okay, and then my last step in this, what I'd like to do is I want to pass in this list of years into my function and then get a value for every year, or a list of values for every year. So to do that, I would come up to the section here on the top of the ribbon where it says Add Column. And underneath Add Column, I can add in my own custom column, and then I can call the function and then pass in my list of years into that function. So I'll select Add Custom Column, all right, and I'll call the NFL data query that we created already, or the function we created, and I'm going to pass into that function the year column that we have inside of our new query. So basically what I'm saying is call the original function, this one here called NFL data, call that function, and then pass in this column into that function. Remember, that function is expecting a year, and so if I feed in a list of years to it, then it should return back all of the values for each year. All right, so I'll hit OK. And you'll see here that indeed it did do that for me. In fact, I can select each of these values here and I can see it looks like it seems to be working. As I select these, you can see below in the very bottom portion here, it's showing me the values for each year. What I'd like to do is to go ahead and bring back the values for each of those years. And to do that, you can come up to the top section here where it says Custom, and you can expand this, and you can tell it that I want to bring back all of the columns from that function. All right, so I'll hit OK. All right, so now what that's done is it's brought me back all of the values using that function from every year. And how do I know it did that right? Well, you can kind of scroll through, and as you scroll down, you'll see it went from the year 2000 to 2001. Scroll a little bit further, you now see 2002 and 2003. Now it's 2004 and 2005. All right, so it seems to be working. Now, if I want to take this a step further and actually visualize this data, I can hit Close and Apply, and we'll do the visualization part pretty quickly because that's not the focus of this webinar. But what I can do is I can take the results of that data, bring it now into Power BI, and create something like a scatter plot on top of it. Now, this is a fairly complex example, and the reason why I'm showing you this one first is because a lot of these things that I've done, they've actually made much easier through the new way the UI works. The new UI changes inside of the Power BI desktop allow you to do a lot of these things much easier. And so I'm going to break a lot of those things down into simpler examples and show you how much easier it is to do those things now. So that's what we're going to do as soon as this one finishes loading. Keep in mind what's happening behind the scenes and why this is taking a few moments is it's actually going and running, 15 different queries against the NFL website. So don't be shocked that it takes a little longer for this. It actually has to do quite a bit of work to bring back that data. All right, so hopefully that should come back fairly quickly. There it goes. And you know what I realized that I forgot to do? That I forgot a few little things here. Let me see if I can do this without it taking too much longer. I want to fix one thing here. Where I expanded the data, there's this one option down here in the bottom where I can tell it I don't want to have a prefix of the word custom. I want to take that off. I don't really want that. And I don't really need all these columns either. Let me just bring back the columns I actually need. So let me fix that, and then we'll be off on our way. So I'm going to bring back the team, the points per game, the yards per game, and then let's bring in penalty yards here as well. Those are the 3 or 4 columns I really care about. All right, so I've got those 4 columns now brought in. I'm going to also convert the data type of a few of these just so we have the proper data type for whenever we go to build a report on this. Do that same thing on this one as well. This will be a whole number, and then I think I have it much better now where we can use this and get more value out of it. All right, so it's going to go ahead and run that again. It's going to pull that data in. We'll put a little visualization on top of it, and then, like I said, we'll move on to some kind of smaller examples, but really show you how the new method of doing parameters works. And I think you'll get a good idea here. While that's actually loading, I'm going to pull up a new instance of Power BI Desktop, so we're ready to go once we're done for this example. All right. I'll tell you a little while this is going a little behind the scenes. When I tried to do this example for the first time, there's data, NFL data, all the way back to like 1932 or something like that, and I thought, well, surely I'd like to get all that data. And so this is a couple of years back when I tried one of these examples first against this data set, and so I told it to bring me back all the data back from 1932 to today, and it took about an hour and some change. And also, I noticed, I don't know if it was just for my IP or for everyone, but anytime I tried to go to the NFL's website after that, I couldn't go to the statistics pages because they were blocking me. So they must have thought I did something malicious to their website because I was pulling them down. I was slowing down their website. All right, so I've gotten what looks like the results here have come through properly now. I'm going to place this into something like a scatter chart. And what I'd like to see is the teams appearing on the legend. And I'd like to see the yards per game showing up on the x-axis, the penalty yards showing up on the y, and the points per game showing up as the size of the bubble. And then tell you what, we'll use the year as a play axis here, so we can actually animate this across time. All right, so let me drop that there, make this a little larger so we can see it better. And what I'll go ahead and do is I'll full screen this here. And if we wanted to, we can add in the data labels. If we want to see which team is which, I can turn on the category labels here so I can actually see which team is which. It's a little bit much for this design surface that we have. But let's go ahead and animate it and see what's going on here. So we can see across time how each of the teams have changed as far as their offensive production. Now, what we're looking at and comparing against here is the yards per game going across horizontally, the penalty yards going vertically, and then the size of the bubble represents the points per game. So what I may want to try and determine is, do penalty yards actually impact the offensive production, the number of yards that they get? And so say, for example, if I'm trying to determine that, the penalty yards is the vertical axis here, so I might try and find one of the teams that has the higher section of the vertical axis here, and I could select them, something like the Buffalo Bills here. And it looks like the Buffalo Bills were kind of in the middle. They had a lot of penalty yards last year, but their offensive production was kind of middle of the pack, almost a little bit better than middle of the pack. So maybe penalty yards don't really impact it like I might have thought. Then you see here 1 year. What year is this? This is 2008, the Buffalo Bills. Sorry, Bills fans. I think you're about the same boat as the Jaguars here. But they had one of the worst offensive productions as far as yards per game, but their penalty yards were still really low. So they weren't getting penalized, but they weren't really moving the ball either. So kind of some interesting here. There isn't as much of a correlation between penalty yards and yards per game as I might have thought. So interesting data, interesting results as to look at. Here you can see New Orleans Saints, they have fairly high penalty yards, but their offensive production is also pretty high. So it might just depend on the team, for example, to determine what is going on with penalty yards here. Okay, so that was our first example. We got to look at how you would do things in the past. Let's now look at how you would do things in the new method of doing parameters. And we're going to do some smaller examples for this, but I did want to show you kind of an end result of what you can do, and now let's dig a little bit deeper into some smaller examples. But that shows you really the beauty of what you can do. I can loop over a bunch of web pages and pull all of this in using parameters. All right, so our first example where we're going to look at the newer way of doing things is we're going to start by going into pulling some new data. So I'm going to go up to the Get Data section here and pull in some data from Excel. So I'll select Excel, and I have a file here called source data. Go figure, that's what I'm going to use for this example. And I'll go ahead and hit open. Now from this Excel file, we're going to be using a table called, that's not the right one. Let me go get the right one here. Let me go try that one more time. Go to Excel, here we go. And it should be here. Here we go. All right. So this one should have in it, that's what I'm looking for. It should have in it a table here called products. I'm going to go ahead and select the products table. And I'll select edit to take this into the query editor. So I'll go ahead and choose edit. Once I've selected the Excel table, you'll notice, by the way, there's spreadsheets and tables here. You can kind of tell by the icon which is which. These are the spreadsheets, the second two, and these are Excel tables above them. All right, by the way, there's the same data in both, but one is an official Excel table, one is more of a spreadsheet. All right, I'm selecting the Excel table called products, and I'll click edit. And what I'd like to do for this first example is show you how you can actually filter this data down with a parameter and how you can start to utilize parameters. So let's say I just wanted to apply a filter to this to begin with. I want to apply a filter where I filter out all the products that do not equal a certain color. Or let's say I only want to see products that equal black. So these are bikes here. It's a bike store. It's a typical AdventureWorks example. And so I'll apply a filter to the color column that we see here, and I'll hit the drop down on it to apply a filter. And you can tell you can do a filter down here, and you can just select black if you wanted to. So I could uncheck all and come down here and select only black if I wanted to. Or you can come over to here where it says text filter, and you can tell it that I want to do a text filter where it only equals, and tell it that where it only equals black. Now, one of the things that's missing from my UI right now is the ability to make a parameter from where we are at right now. I should be able to make a parameter right here, but it's actually a feature that's turned off by default. So if you're interested in doing parameters, pay close attention to this next thing that I'm going to show you, because you'll likely want to turn this feature on, and it's a bit hidden. It's turned off by default. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK on this, and we'll apply the filter to black. Okay, so I'll hit OK. You can see the filter worked, and it also added a step on the right-hand side. But there's a setting inside of the Power BI options that allows you to turn on a special feature to make parameters always visible. Because right now, you notice there was no parameter option there, but if I go back over to this section, up to the File menu up in the top left, so select File, and go underneath Options and Settings and find Options. Okay, so I'll give you a second if you're jotting down notes or anything. This is important. Go to File, Options and Settings, and then Options. You'll find underneath the section here for the Query Editor, it's the second one down. Underneath the Query Editor section, there's an option that is turned off by default for you called Always Allow Parameterization in Data Source and Transformation Dialogues. So basically what that's telling you is it's always going to allow you to parameterize those features. Data sources and transforms, you can parameterize them. By default, the parameterization option doesn't show until you create at least one parameter, meaning you'd have to create a parameter ahead of time, and then you can go apply it to the query. Well, that's probably not the way that we most logically think. Usually we're trying to filter things down and we want to create a parameter as we do it. So you'll likely want to turn on this feature, and you'll see it's going to appear multiple times here in a few moments whenever we get to actually using it. So I'll hit OK. And we've now turned on that feature, and what that does is now the next time I go to filter, say for example I want to apply that same filter again, I'm going to kill that filter we just did a few moments ago. And so say for example we want to apply that filter again, just to walk through those steps one more time. If I were to go back up to the color column and hit the down arrow and do text filter again and select it as equal filter, you'll notice this option now appears here. This was not here a few moments ago. This option right here allows me to now create a new parameter or select from an existing one. And because we don't have an existing one, that option is grayed out here. So this is a new feature. This feature allows you to turn this on, so you always are able to see that you can parameterize features. I don't know why this is not on by default. It feels like something that you would likely want to see, and it's not so obtrusive for those that don't know what to do with it that they just wouldn't click on it. So I think it's something that they probably should turn on by default long term. All right, so I want to create a new parameter. So I'm going to select new parameter here, and rather than just filtering on the text black, I'm going to create a parameter for it so I can easily change the value that we're working with. So I'll click black, and then this will launch open the parameters dialog box where you can create a name for the parameter right here. Okay, so up at the very top you'll likely want to go ahead and call this parameter something like color. That's fine. I would also recommend that you always add a description. Okay, that might feel like something that you oftentimes skip when it comes to other products, but when it comes to parameters here, I definitely recommend adding in a description, and you'll see why here in a few moments. But if you don't add in a description, you're completely relying on the name of the parameter to tell users what to do. So if I just say color, then my users might be a little bit confused on what to do with that, so I should really do something like let's actually do this. Select the color you would like to filter the results on. Okay, so if I do something like that, then that tells them how to actually interact with the parameter. And I'm going to show you what it looks like from the user experience here in a few moments. All right, so we've named it, we've given it a description. You can also define whether or not you want it to be required, so it could meaning that it could be an optional parameter. That's an option here. And then you can also tell what kind of data type it should be. Okay, in our case this is a text data type, so you can go ahead and select text. We're typing in a string value. And then where it says allowed values, this is where you have some flexibility with how does a user interact with a parameter. Are they going to get a text box that they just type something in, and that's what any value means. Okay, so if I leave this as any value, it gives them a text box and they have to type something in. If I use list of values, then I'm going to give them a list of values, so I basically would type in blue, black, green, purple, that sort of thing. Or there's also an option here where you can provide the values from a query. Now this option seems a little not ready for prime time yet from my interaction with it, because there's a lot of things I would like it to do that it can't do yet. But you can certainly play around with it, but just note that basically what it's allowing you to do is get the results from another query. It doesn't quite work how you would think, like if you've worked with reporting services, for example, before, it won't necessarily create a list of values for you based off of a query, but it'll allow you to basically filter down results based off of a query. Okay, so here's what we'd like to do. I want to do a list of values for this one. And so that means I'm not going to give them an empty text box that they type in values. I'm actually going to give them a list of values that I type in up at the top here. So I would do something like, well, I'll allow them to select red, I'll allow them to select black, and just one more, I'll allow them to select blue. Those are the options I'm providing to them that they can select from a list. All right, and so then I'll go ahead and give some kind of a default value. So I have to have a default value so it knows how to actually run and present data. So I'm going to default this parameter to blue, and then I'm going to make a current value of also blue. So the difference between these two is this is the default. Whenever someone goes to just open this up, it's going to default to blue. But the current value is what I am currently looking at right now, meaning you can change the current but still have the default be something else. So they do mean something different. All right. All right, so now I have this taken care of. I'll go ahead and hit OK on this. And we're going to do that a couple more times on some other examples, so don't worry, you'll see that box again. And then I'll hit OK because now I've changed it from rather than filtering on the word black, I'm now using the color parameter here that we have just created a moment ago. All right, so I'll hit OK. And now you'll see the results immediately filter down the results to just return back blue. Now I can also go back over to where it says, you'll see on the left-hand side where it says queries. I have the query that we're looking at right now called products, but I also have this one here called color. That's actually our parameter that we created a few moments ago. And so if I go over to that parameter, I can change the value here from blue to something like red and go back over to products, and I can see now that I am looking at only red products. Okay, so you can see that parameter is working. Again, I can go back over to the parameter, change it to black this time if I want, and you can see we're only seeing the color black in our products. All right, so here's how it works from a user perspective. Now we're all here inside of the query editor. If you have folks that are more data consumers and you don't anticipate them actually using the query editor, but then maybe they'll interact from a reporting standpoint, here's what they'll see. If I hit close and apply and get out of the query editor here for a moment, it's going to load the results. Now keep in mind, it's only loading the results for the last filter that I had. So I had filtered it to black, so I should only be seeing results for black. How do I know that? Well, let's build a little report for it. If I build a report and put the color in there, you can see, yes, it is showing the color black. I'll make the text a bit larger here in a moment too. And let's go ahead and do that now. Let me increase the text size here. Let's see. Where did the text size go? They've updated something. Okay, under general, excuse me. All right, so there we go. I can see that a little bit better now. All right. Now, how I can interact with this, if I want to change what that parameter is doing in the reporting view, is I would come up to the top section here where you see Edit Queries. So right here where you see Edit Queries, you'll notice there's a drop-down selection, and what that drop-down selection will allow you to do is you can either edit the query, which will launch the query editor again that we were looking at already. You can edit the data source. That's a pretty new feature as well that allows you to change the data source connection. Or I can edit the parameter. And if I choose Edit Parameter, it'll pop open a new dialog for me that allows me to actually select and give a value for my parameter. So I can change the color here from black to red and hit OK. It'll, once I hit Apply Changes up at the top, it'll rerun the query for me, and it'll now bring back the results for just red. So I didn't have to necessarily know what was going on behind the scenes. This just now allows me to interact with it here. Now I do see some questions. I'll go ahead and answer this question now because we have, it's a good time for it. The question is, how does this look, how does the parameter look from the web client? So this is one downside of it, of Power BI so far, is the parameterization feature that I'm showing you right now is really just to the desktop. If I went to go publish this to the web, there's not really any interaction you have with the parameter. It's more just showing the results of what you have already created. So good question. A little bit, you're absolutely right. It is a bummer so far that you can't really do anything with that thus far. But hopefully that will come soon. I wouldn't be shocked if it does. And the nice thing is that from the web services functionality, they make updates to that very regularly. So that's something that could come at any moment, and it would allow us to interact with this a little bit better. Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to show you, so we've kind of taken a look at how we can use this. How do you interact with it? You come up to the Edit Queries section here, and you select Edit Parameters. You can change the parameter value here to a different one if you want. Hit Apply Changes, and it'll rerun the query. That works just fine. What I'd like to do next is show you how you can do a few other more advanced capabilities with parameters. So I'm going to close this out, relaunch another Power BI desktop instance. The reason I'm doing that is because I just don't want to bother deleting everything here and getting a little confused by all the stuff I have on my screen. So I'm going to open up a fresh instance for this next example. And what I'm going to do in this next example is a little bit different. The first example, what we did here was we walked through how you could parameterize a filter, right? So we made it so that the filter could be made dynamic. But what I'd like to do in this case is show you how you can make a table dynamic. So basically you can have it so that the users could swap the table that they want very easily from inside of the Power BI desktop. Okay. Now, my recommendation for this, I'll give you here in a few moments of how you might use this technique, but for the time being, let's kind of walk through how this works, and then I think it'll make more sense once I have it complete to describe to you why you might do something like this. But the idea here is I want to make a reference to a table, and that table should be made dynamic. Okay, and there's a lot of there's a few downsides to doing this that I want to point out to you as well, but it's kind of a neat feature that you can do. So for this example, what I'd like to do is I'm going to connect to a SQL Server database instead of an Excel spreadsheet this time. So I'm going to go up to the top ribbon here where it says Get Data, and I'm going to connect to SQL Server. So I'll type in SQL Server here. There we go. And for my SQL Server options, oh, by the way, I should mention, because we turned on that feature, remember when we went to File and then Options and we turned on the feature to always show parameters? You can notice here that you have an option now to create parameters from this location. So you wouldn't have had that until we turned on that feature earlier. Remember, we turned on that feature by going underneath Files and Options and Settings. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and make define how to connect to my SQL Server database. It's just a local instance that I have, and we'll connect to the AdventureWorks database, and we will hit OK. Now for this example, what we're going to do is we're going to select the DIM customer table right here, and I'll click Edit. Okay. Now there's a couple things I want to warn you about with this method that I'm going to show you. The neat thing about this is you can make the table that you're going to return dynamic. In fact, I'll even change the name of the query over here because it's going to be changed dynamically. So I'll just call this my dynamic table. Okay. Now the downside of doing this is any of the transforms you want to apply have to be applicable to the table that you switch to. Meaning, if I switch to a different table that has a bunch of my query already has a bunch of transforms on it, then those transforms need to also be able to apply on the new table that I switch to, which pretty much is never going to happen unless the new table you switch to has the exact same column names with the exact same data types. So here's the context of how I think this might be kind of useful. Is you might import a bunch of static tables that your users, you know your users are always going to use, and then you may import this kind of dynamic table option that I'm about to show you, so that way your users can kind of swap out one table for another table, but you're never going to be able to apply transforms to it. So it's just basically going to be a dump of the data that you have inside of that table and just present it so they can kind of dynamically swap out tables if they wanted to. Okay, so keep in mind, here's what I'm telling you, don't apply transforms to this if you're going to change and swap out the table because they won't work on the new table likely. All right, so that's my little warning to you there. All right, so here's what we're going to do is we're going to create a parameter this time called table name. And so I'm going to go up to the section here called Manage Parameters. We did a parameter kind of differently last time, but I'm going to go to where it says Manage Parameters. I'll hit the drop down, and we're going to create a brand new parameter by selecting New Parameter. All right, so I'll hit the down arrow, select New Parameters here, and then I'm going to go ahead and call this parameter Table Name, okay? And we'll give it some kind of a description here. We'll call it, this is my dynamic table. It's fine. And one thing I'll also point out to you is there's a little bit of added work if you have spaces in your parameter name. I'm going to actually leave the space there because I want to show you what that added work is. But when you have spaces in your parameter names, there's a little bit of extra work you might have to do here and there, especially for this example that I'm about to show you. It's going to add a little extra work for us. But just note that you can have spaces in the names of the parameters. All right, cool. So what I'd like to do now is I've given the parameter a name, I've given it a description, I'm going to go ahead and give it a data type. This is going to be a text value. And then I can now tell it, do I want to allow them to type in a list of type in values on their own, or do I want to give them a list of values? Okay, so remember we talked about that earlier. You can type in values, basically giving the user an empty text box, or I can create a list of values. That's what we did in the last example, where I kind of gave it a list of blue, black, red. I'll tell you what, for this example, I'm just going to leave it as any value where it's going to give us a text box where I have to physically type in the table name just so you can see the difference for this example. All right, so I'll hit OK. Oh, I do have to give it some kind of current value. Our current value is going to be customer, dim customer. So I'll hit OK, and it's now created a parameter for us. Now keep in mind, the parameter is in no way connected to my query yet. There's no connection to this dynamic table query. It's just a parameter that is sitting all by itself. Okay, so just be aware of that. So what we're going to do here is to make this dynamic, there's not really anything we can do to edit the steps over here. You'll notice if you go look at the steps of the original query that you do see a list of all the table names. Unfortunately, that if you apply to filter this for a filter to this item column, by the way, for example, is it'll actually mess a lot of things up. So you really can't make any parameterization on the steps. What we're going to have to do in this case is go to the advanced editor like we did in that first example I showed you. Okay? So in that first example, what we did was we went up to the top ribbon and we selected advanced editor, and you can see the results of my query here. Okay, and now remember what I told you is if you applied any transforms to this query, those would likely be nullified on this new table because it's probably going to be referencing certain column names, certain data types that you may not have inside of this new table. Okay. All right, so here's what I'll do is I'll go ahead and select and I'll change the value that I have right here that now is selected as dim customer, and I will replace that with, instead of telling it that I want to bring in dim customer, I'm going to replace it with my dynamic table name parameter, which is called table name, and we're going to put a little pound sign in front of this, and that's really the feature that you have to have if you have spaces in your parameter name. Because I have a space in my parameter name, it requires double quotes and a pound sign in front of it. Okay. All right, so I'll hit done. Right now you see the results did not change at all because it's still the same table. But if I go back over to my parameter here and change this to something like dim product, hit enter, you'll now see I'm looking at product information here instead of customer information. So the interesting question, so John asked this question in the chat window, what's a business example for why you might use this? So here's what my thought is. My thought is I would go and I would bring this into Power BI. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and load this dynamic table in. And my thought is I would go ahead and load in a bunch of static tables, right? So I would bring in my static tables that we look at a regular time frame. I always look at these. But I might have one dynamic table inside of that same data set that I use so that my users that need a little bit more flexibility, need to be able to go beyond just the table that I provided in the static example where I import, these 5 tables are my static tables that I always bring in, but I can give them the option to have this dynamic table, and then what they can do with that dynamic table is they can import something else. They can come up to the top here and they can say, well, what I'd like to do is instead of looking at dim customer, I can edit the parameter up top here, and instead of looking at, dim product, we could look at something like dim geography instead. So it just gives them a little bit more flexibility where they can swap things out, and they can swap out to a different table. Now, of course, they would have to have permissions to this new table. You can see this is a completely new table that I've now added in, but I see this as something that you can do in addition to having the standard static tables that they would always look at. This gives them a little bit more flexibility, and it might make a more scalable solution because maybe you can scale this out where multiple people can now use it because I can have Jim in finance now add in his own table information that he wants. All right, so just an interesting way you can kind of work with it. All right, cool. So that's one other example. Let's go do another one. The next one that I want to show you is how you can really make it a more dynamic connection. Okay, so we've talked about how you can make dynamic filters, how you can make, in this case, a dynamic table. I did have an example where you can actually make the columns dynamic, and basically we'd swap out a select statement with a different select statement, that sort of thing. Well, this last one that we have time for is I'd like to show you how to make a connection dynamic, and then we'll also get into how you can do templates. So for this last one, I'm going to go ahead and go back over here to Edit Query, and I'm going to delete everything we have thus far. Okay, and we're kind of starting from scratch here. And we're going to go ahead and connect back into SQL Server again for this one. So I'll select New Source and select SQL Server. And what we'll do here is I will come up to the top here and I will give it my server name. Okay. And then for the database, here's what I'm going to make dynamic. Now you could make either the server name or the database name. I only have one server name to connect to right now on my local machine, so I'm going to use the database to make it dynamic. But here's kind of an instance of what you might do with this. What I might do with this is I might want to make it so that I create a Power BI solution on top of my development environment, but I want to easily be able to swap this over to QA or test or production and see what the results might look like whenever I swap it over to a different data source. And so that might mean swapping the server out. Probably most likely you'd swap the server out and make a parameter out of the server. But in my case, again, I don't have multiple servers to connect to, so I'm going to show you this example by making the database dynamic. And so to make the database dynamic, you'll change this little drop down here and we'll select that we want to make a new parameter on the database. So I'll select new database here. And I'll call this my, remember this is the parameters dialog box that we've seen a couple times now. And so I'll call this my database parameter, give it some kind of name. So I could do something like select the environment you would like your reports based on. Okay, I can give it a data type of text. That's what a database name would be. And then I would also tell it that I'm going to give it specific values here. I don't want my users typing in any kind of database names or server names, so I'm going to give them a list of values, and I'm going to list out the databases that are options for them. So the AdventureWorks DW2000, oh, spelling does matter. AdventureWorks DW 2012 would be one. And then I'll make the same thing here, but I'll make this one 2016. So I have two different databases that I can swap back and forth, and then you'll see how this is going to work here in a moment. Now I do have to default it to some kind of value here on the bottom, so I'm going to default this to 2016, and I'll make the current value also 2016, and then I'll hit OK. So we basically created a parameter. We're going to swap out the database that's used inside of our results, and then we're going to create a template on top of this. So I'll hit OK. You can see that the database connection is now using a parameter instead of a hard-coded database, and I'll hit OK again. Now it's going to prompt me to select the table that I'd like to use, and in this case what I'll select is the fact internet sales table right here. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and hit OK to consume this result. So I'll hit OK here. All right, great. So I've got the results now listed here, and I'm going to leave this alone. I'm not going to do anything fancy with the results. I'm going to go ahead and hit close and apply on this now that we've got the data in. And keep in mind that the default or the current value for that parameter was set to see AdventureWorks 2016. So I should see some results that indicate that time frame. So I'm going to start by bringing into a report the order date, and I'll bring in something like the sales amount. There we go. And so I can see the results here. We're looking at 2010 to 2014 data. You can see the results showing as that. I'm going to even make this a little larger here. And then what I'd like to do is show you how I can make the parameter work. So just like we saw before, if I wanted to change the parameter, I can come up to where it says Edit Queries and select Edit Parameters, and I can swap this out. Instead of using the 2016 database, I can use the 2012 database and hit OK, and you'll notice that immediately once I hit Apply Changes, that it's now going to change the results. You can even see the years have changed here based on the 2012 database. All right, so that's kind of how the parameter piece works. Now what I'd really like to do is take the results of this as our final demo and make it into a template, because what I want to do is take this solution that we create. Let's say we had 5 different pages of reports on here, and I'd like to take the solution that we've created, hand this off to another user, allow them to plug in which database they want to see. So maybe it's another customer, for example. Maybe it's not even another AdventureWorks database, but it's another customer that's based off the same data structures. Then I can allow them to do that with a template. Now creating templates is pretty simple. To create a template out of the solution that we've done so far, I would come up to the File menu in the top left, so go up to File and select Export. So you go to File, Export, and then you'll see there's only one option here right now called Power BI Template, so we can export this to a template. Again, just to remind you from the very beginning of this webinar, the whole idea of doing a template is to compartmentalize everything we've done so far. So the query, the data model, the reports that we've done, all of that will be compartmentalized into this template. None of the data is brought into that template, but because we have a parameter on this, the user, whenever they open up the template, is going to be prompted to key in some information. They're going to be prompted to select which database they want to use in our example in this case. All right? So if we select the Power BI template export, okay, and we give it some kind of, this is a description for the template, so give the template some sort of a description. So we can do, this is a sales report template, something like that. Hit OK. Then save the template somewhere. So we'll save this, let me save this somewhere I can find it easily. On my desktop is fine. I'll overwrite this one I already have here. Okay, so I now save the template. I can close this out if I wanted to. I'm not even gonna save this as a Power BI desktop file, but I could if I wanted to. And now I'm gonna go to my desktop and find that template. So this is the Power BI template that we created just a few moments ago. You can see it just created at 10 right now, so 11:50, that's my time right now. And if I open up this template, what happens is it's going to launch Power BI Desktop, and it's going to be prompting me to provide some information about the parameter. So you can see the template example. Here's where the description is useful. You should probably do a better description than I did, but when you provide a description, the user will actually see that here. And then you can select from the list of values that you have inside of your parameter which results you'd like to see. When you select that value, you can hit either load or edit. I'm going to go ahead and hit load, and it will immediately load in the data from the parameter value that I selected. Okay, so I selected 2016, so you should see the results revert back to what we saw in our first example. Okay. So I just glanced over for a quick question. I saw, would the template work the same way with a filter parameter? Absolutely, yeah. So if you had a parameter that was doing a filter like we did in one of our earlier examples, that would also prompt you inside the template. Whenever they go to open up the template, it would prompt them to provide that information. So that's kind of how the templates work. The templates are very simple. The idea here, though, is I can hand this off to somebody else, and as long as the database, in this case that they selected, has all the same data structures, which in this case I gave them a drop-down box that they can select from, then it would rebuild all the reports around their selection. Okay, and if I went back to go open up that template again, let's try that one more time. I open up the template again, and this time if I open up the template and I select a different database, then it's going to give me a different solution. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select the 2012 database this time, hit load, and we'll see the results for the 2012 database. Now, one thing I want to prove to you here real quickly as we wrap up, and I'll take some questions the last 5 minutes or so here. I'm going to go ahead and save this desktop file this time. This is not saving the template, this is saving the desktop file. And so I'll call this my webinar example, save it to the folder that we've been working in, and I want to point you to the files that are created here, so particularly the last two files here. The second file is the one that I just saved. This is the PBIX file. This is the Power BI desktop file that has in it the data model, the query, the reports, and it also has the data in it. The template file is the one right above, the PBIT file, only stores in it the metadata of the query, the data model, and the reports. It's not storing any of the actual data that's to be presented inside the report, and you'll notice because of that the file size is significantly different. So you can kind of tell very easily here that the template is only storing in it a structure of what is in your solution and not the actual data. So keep that in mind as you use these. And the templates are great. I've seen some customers of ours are already using these to be able to have somebody that's very proficient in doing the data model and the query and maybe even some of the reporting stuff, but handing it off to more of a data consumer user where they can select or type in a value, whether it's typing in a value for a database name or typing in a value for a filter, and then have everything around that parameter start to build out the report, and everything around that template start to build out. So very interesting way of doing things. That's really it for our presentation, but what I'll do is I'll spend the last 5 minutes or so here taking questions. I'll also put up my contact information here if you want to reach out later. We do have, by the way, a class that does cover on how to do some of these features, so some of you may have already seen some of that material, but it is a neat way to be able to use these features. There's a question, can you edit a template? Unfortunately, not right as of this moment can you do that, but basically what you would do if you want to edit a template is you would just have to overwrite the previous template and do save as a template again. Do parameters work with tabular or SSAS? They do, and they work pretty well. The one caveat I should mention when it comes to parameters, guys, is if you're doing things like direct query or a live connection to your data source, oftentimes you'll be limited with the types of parameters that you can use whenever you're doing a live connection to a data source. So that kind of dovetails into what may be another question for some of you. Let's see, what else? Let me go back to the top. I want to get some of the top questions here. Let's see, what version are you using? I'm using May 2016. I am using one from, so this is a question from Bill. Bill, I'm using one from, that was a July release, very late July. If you connect to web service, does it make a report a live connection to the website? Okay, so this is, actually had a question about the earlier example I had where I connected to the website, the NFL data. It is not a live connection to the data on the website. It actually pulls that data into the data model, and you'd have to work out doing your data refresh on that. Let's see. It would be nice to have parameters as a fixed item on the report and not, yeah, I agree, Aman. So Aman's point here is it would be nice, just let me pull this back open for a moment. His point is it would be really nice if you didn't have to hit this drop-down box and to do edit parameters, that it actually had a very relevant button in here. I agree, that would be much nicer. I saw some comments about could you use it with slicers. Not really anything built in where you could kind of dovetail it into a slicer yet. I would anticipate something like that happening though, because it seems like just a natural next step for this. So Sharon has a question here. Could be useful for repetition required for to maintain security. I could certainly see how you could tie it in with that to some extent. I wouldn't call this security. You know, there is row level security that's built into Power BI, but I could see how you can kind of work the two together to make a security model. Sure. So Diane asked, when swapping tables, the transforms will not apply even if the tables have the same data structure. So she's asking that question. If the new table, so this is regarding the example where I swapped out tables. If the new table that you swap to has all the same column names, all the same data types, it's just simply that you're swapping out the table name, then it will still work. It's just a matter of swapping out the table name in that matter, and everything else will work after that. Let's see, and how much time? We have a couple more minutes here. Here's a question. I have millions of records in my SQL fact table. Is this a good solution, doing parameters? I would absolutely agree with that. So if you are working with a very large data set where you have millions or billions of rows inside of the table you're trying to work with, and you're trying to be able to limit those results as you pull them in, it could either be that you have a more traditional filter where you filter all the results inside the query editor, or you could use parameters so that way it's a little bit more dynamic, and you can say maybe your parameter is to bring back just this year, but you could change it so that it could also bring back next year or the prior year, or maybe a grouping of years as well. So yeah, I agree. This is parameters and filters here would be a good way to be able to filter down that results. Can you publish a template as opposed to the normal PBIX file? Good question, John. John, I recognize that name. John, no, you can't publish the templates. You can publish them into like your report manager. So if you're using SQL Server 2016, where you have the ability to publish Power BI assets to reporting services, you can publish the template there. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do with it when it's published there. It's more just kind of a file share if you publish it to reporting services. But PowerBI.com, you cannot deploy templates there. Let's see, what else? A lot of people like the templates piece, so that's good. I'll get one or two more questions here and we'll kind of wrap up. Oh, so there's a lot of questions around, is the session recorded? It is, and Liz, we usually have it up by Thursday, right?
They'll receive the email tomorrow with the link to the recording, and it will already be up. So.
Okay, great. Good deal. So I think we're out of time anyways here. It would take me more time than to do a little bit more questions. But if you guys have questions, what I usually try and do as a follow-up is blog about them. So great questions I see in here. So what I'll do is I'll try and take some of the questions we didn't have time to address and blog those at my blog. It's called devonKnightSQL.com. You can also reach out to me. Here's my contact info again. But you can also look forward to the recording if you weren't able to sit in from the beginning. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and that's it for me.
Yep, thanks everybody. And as Devon said, feel free to email him questions, or for some reason you didn't grab his contact information, you can always email me, Liz, and I'll be happy to pass those along. Like he said, the recording will be available tomorrow and you'll receive an email. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Devon.